All right, welcome to Cwic Show. My name is Greg Mattson, and I am your host. In this episode, we are going to talk about the church and the Respect for Marriage Act yet again. I've spoken to a number of sources and have had some time to think more about this. I want to delve into some of the talking points on this and some of the things that really we each need to know more about. Before we get into that, this episode, as many of them are, is brought to you by Cardio Miracle here. True story, I was at a doctor yesterday, a personal doctor that I go to, and he was talking to me about prevention, and I do search for those types of doctors that work not only on the medical side, but they actually look at prevention. And without any provocation of any sort, he brought up the idea of preventative health with my heart and cardiovascular health. And he said specifically, make sure you keep your nitric oxide levels up. No joke. In fact, he brought up sources for that. He said, you ought to look at L-arginine, which is I think it's the number one ingredient in Cardio Miracle. And he also talked about beetroots, which is another major ingredient in Cardio Miracle. So anyway, I take this product every single day. I think that any of you that have any type of ailments or are looking for preventative health supplements, this is something you ought to look at. I take it for several reasons and have measurable, reliable data on changes that this product has helped me with. All right, so the Respect for Marriage Act. I want to, this episode's mostly to give you information. I want to give you information for you to digest yourself, right? The number one thing I try to do with this broadcast is to bring you awareness. That's number one. There are other things I try to do as well, but that's number one. But there are also some points in this episode where I want to give you facts and or perceived facts as I see them. And here are a couple of those facts. Number one, there are those in the church that are concerned because of this statement. They're concerned about the doctrine about a man and a woman being married in the temple, only a man and a woman, that's what marriage is. I want to squash that concern as much as possible. We have to be able to separate the doctrine and objectives of the church from the culture, and especially in the U.S. where we live in a pluralistic society. You've got to be able to divide those. The church is not changing its doctrine. It is not going to change its doctrine. As I said to someone the other day, that would be a stake in the heart to the church. That is not against the LGBTQ community whatsoever. It is simply the doctrine of the church. It is the doctrine of the plan of salvation. And there are ways where all of us can be included and assimilate to these doctrines. And they primarily have to do with our relationship with God. That's number one, all right? But they're not going to, the church is not going to change the doctrine on this. Now, they say this specifically when we go to the statement that came out on the Respect for Marriage Act on this. And it's in the very first paragraph here on the statement. It says here, the doctrine of the church, this is the first thing they say, the doctrine of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints related to marriage between a man and a woman is well known, because we've fought for that for a long time, and will remain unchanged. That's the first thing it states. Now, notice this is the doctrine of the church. We have to separate that from what we support or what we do in the cultural wars here. And I think that we're so used to in our environment, and the church is a part of this too, as far as how they've led in the culture war many times. We're so used to thinking that we are supposed to politicize our doctrine and our principles and objectives of the church out to the broader culture, to our societies. And, there is a definite difference. Sometimes there might be overlap there, but there is a definite difference between getting involved with a culture war and preaching repentance and the principles of the gospel and inviting those to come in. I've given you the example of the ark previously. Maybe I'll revisit that in a bit, inviting people into the ark. There is a difference, and I think we're so politicized in our culture that we think that it's one and the same. Well, this is my spiritual, my doctrinal beliefs here, and therefore I am supposed to politicize that out in the broader culture. Well, maybe you vote for those things, but how involved are you in the cultural side of things, in the culture war, as compared to building up the kingdom of God? I would reference Elder Holland's talk last year at BYU, right? The famous/infamous talk with the muskets, where he's talking to the faculty of BYU, and he's saying, and he's actually quoting then Elder Oaks and Elder Maxwell also, both brought up the same example. It's not just his, about having the trowel, right? Turning back and having the trowel as you're building up the wall or building up the kingdom of God. And then you have the muskets there defending it. It's an issue of defense. It's almost always, go through the Book of Mormon, right? They're not out trying to politicize things with the Lamanites. They're trying to preach the gospel. When they do have incursions in there, they are preaching the gospel. And when they are threatened from the outside by the Lamanites and from the inside by, say, the Amlicites, it's a matter of defense. Just some points of reference there to look at. Okay, so the doctrine is not changing. Do not worry about that. This is not an earthquake under your feet that is, should make you wonder what is happening with the doctrine of the church. That's not what's happening. We will get into some things here that I think are rather nuanced, but again, I think it's important to have awareness on these things. Number two, and this is also important to understand, and this is maybe on the other end of the spectrum on this. I've had a number of people, I've seen this online quite a bit, a number of people respond to me on the previous episode that I did on this, that saying that the church is not supporting this bill. And they go into the verbiage on the statement from the church and trying to show how we're not really supporting the bill. That is hogwash. That's not true. And it would take a lot to talk yourself out of that, or have the church talk themselves out of that. They are supporting the bill. That's why the statement is made. And I think a lot of people have some cognitive dissonance here because they're saying, well, wait a minute, how can the church be supporting same-sex marriage in the culture, in the U.S., when the church doesn't believe in same-sex marriage? And again, it's that separation there that you need to look at. But they are supporting the bill. All right, they wouldn't make this statement if they didn't. And let's go back to the verbiage on the bill here so that you can see this. The second paragraph says, we are grateful for the continuing efforts of those who work to ensure the Respect for Marriage Act include appropriate religious protection, that's one side of it, religious freedom protections, while respecting the law, and the law of the land is same-sex marriage, and preserving the rights of our LGBTQ brothers and sisters. What rights are mentioned here? It's same-sex marriage. Okay, they're supporting the bill. And the third paragraph, we believe this approach is the way forward. This is the approach that they've etched out, right? This is what they're doing is they cut their way through the wilderness here, through the forest, through the jungle. We believe this is the way forward as we work together to preserve the principles and practices of religious freedom, that's the one side, together with the rights of LGBTQ individuals, that's the other side. Much can be accomplished to heal relationships and foster greater understanding. I believe that can be true at a small scale. I do not believe that is true on a large scale. That this is an inevitable collision course. When you're talking about marriage in the temple, it's an inevitable, and our doctrine, right? It's not going to stop just from practice. It's never going to stop the opposition to the church's doctrine on marriage being between a man and a woman. Right? That will never stop. But again, we believe this approach is the way forward. That's what this bill is. This bill is, depending on your interpretation, strengthening religious freedoms and increasing the rights of the LGBTQ community. Okay, that's what the church is doing. That is their designed approach to move forward. They are supporting the bill, and you're going to see in the future other similar bills at a state level and at a federal level that I believe you will see the church support. Okay, because they are now entrenched in this path that they've carved out. Right, they are entrenched, and so they're going to be there to help support this move forward. Now, whether or not that is wise, you can think about that. You can say, okay, well, wait a minute. This is coming from the church. These are prophets. They've got vision that we don't have. That's all true. But I think it's very important that we understand the nuances here. This is one thing I wish that they would have done here with this, is that they would add a why to the members of the church. I do believe we deserve that. Right? You have members of the church that dedicate their lives and their families to the church, to callings, to their belief systems. Their heart, minds, and souls are 100% in this. And I think you've got to have, and I don't think they will offer a reason why. I really don't. For reasons maybe I'll go into at another time. But I don't think you're going to see that. I just wish we did. Okay. Now, moving beyond this, I want to go a little bit more into the religious freedom portion of this. You have basically two camps on this. One is that, and this is my belief, and I've talked about this in the previous episode on this act. I believe that we have lost the culture war. And a lot of people really push back with me on that. And they're like, no, we have to keep fighting for this. We have to fight and fight and fight. And this is the promised land. And this is the covenantal area, the covenantal land, so to speak. And that's all true. But this is not going back. It's just, this is not going back. That doesn't mean your vote doesn't matter. That doesn't mean if you want to get involved politically and that you shouldn't. In fighting some of these things. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that it is very unlikely that we're going to have a return to marriage between just a man and a woman. And, even with a very conservative court, Supreme Court like we have right now, this is so far beyond the abortion issue. I don't think that we're going to be able to turn that around. And I think that's where the church is. I think the church says, look, we're not going to die on this hill. This is not where we're going to die. We are going to look down the road and we're going to look at the next hill. And that next hill is our doctrine and our religious practice. And we do not want the state to intrude into our religious beliefs, our doctrine, and our practices, especially in the temple. And that's what they're moving toward. They're trying to get ahead of the game. There's questions about that. But I believe that's what they are doing. And that's why you see this kind of support for this type of bill. They've already conceded the culture war. The church has conceded that Babylon, so to speak, has moved and progressed so far that we're not going to be able to turn those things around. And so what we need to do is protect the temple and the doctrine as much as possible, looking down the road. Okay. Now, I want to go to an article that was written, an editorial by Paul Miro in the Salt Lake Tribune. And he brings up a couple of things on this that I think we need to look at. And again, whether or not I agree with all of these things, these are points that we should all be educated on. He says here in this article, went out yesterday, those unenlightened legal counselors, he's talking about the legal advice that the church gets. who convinced LDS church leaders to aggressively pursue legal discrimination. They say, well, wait a minute, isn't this for the rights of the LGBTQ community? It is, but not for the church. The legal discrimination is religious discrimination, or discrimination coming from a religious body. In other words, if you think about the two-pronged approach on this of conceding LGBTQ rights and increasing religious freedom rights, what it actually is doing is saying we're going to open up more in the temporal sense, in the secular sense, in the political sense, the rights of the LGBTQ community, but we want the ability on the religious side to strengthen our ability to discriminate, especially when it comes to marriage, so that we can hold on to our religious beliefs that do not coincide with what we support politically and what we support legally. That's what they're saying. Open up the rights as much as possible is what they're now saying on the political side, but strengthen the protections against those rights for us religiously, right? So he says, the legal discrimination within the inequitable provisions of Utah state and local discrimination ordinances. They're talking about the previous laws that came through with the Fairness for All Act in Utah. Legal discrimination within the inequitable provisions of Utah state and local non-discrimination ordinances now extended to the Respect for Marriage Act. So there is a DNA to this. The church has been working on this for quite a while, in terms of supporting gay rights while trying to support religious freedom rights at the same time. Now, there is a major difference in what has happened here with this Respect for Marriage Act. And that is, while the church previously has been for increasing the rights, in fact, even, and this is different than just a right, this is the civil rights of LGBTQ individuals, while increasing religious freedom rights. This is the first time that the church has moved beyond just saying civil rights of the individuals to going to same-sex marriage. It's the first time that they have supported this as part of what it is. But of course, inevitably, that's where it always is going to go. You start talking about opening up LGBTQ civil rights, eventually it's going to go to marriage, of course. And that's why that last line in the statement of the church, when it says, hopefully we have healing and understanding, again, for a minority of people, I think that's true, but ultimately it's not, because it always will go to marriage, which means it's that the attacks to the church will always come as long as our practices forbid it and our doctrine forbids it. Right? That's not going to stop. He says that these local non-discrimination ordinances, now extended the Respect for Marriage Act, are the same attorneys who dreamt up the LDS Church's losing legal strategy presented to Justin Anthony Kennedy in the Obergefell ruling that legalized same-sex marriages nationwide. All right, so this is the thing here, is there's a couple of points on this. One, the church attorneys, basically those that are hired by the church to represent them legally, they went to the Supreme Court arguing and giving their position on Obergefell, right? And they're basically saying, hey, we support LGBTQ rights. In fact, we even support same-sex marriage. We just don't support it within the church. And what Paul Merrill here is saying is, look, you think you're being open to, as if someone like a Justice Kennedy is going to say, oh, great for you. We love hearing that. That's not the case. Right? That is not the case. As long as you're saying, but in our church, we don't do this, people are going to see right through the fact that you're offering LGBTQ rights. As the church becomes more and more entrenched in this path, and I'm not saying it's wrong, it might be the exact right thing, but I'm just saying that as we become more and more entrenched in this, now with same-sex marriage, the obvious reaction to this eventually is going to be, yeah, but you don't even believe about it yourself. How hypocritical is that? You're supporting same-sex marriage in the public space, but you don't support it in the church, right? And so it takes into question the stance in the first place. Where are you standing on this? Just keep that in mind, because you'll see this going forward. And again, why am I saying these things? Why do we want this out there? Because you need to be educated on this. Not that I'm the one educating you, but I want to make you aware of these things. You're going to need to look into these things more, because this is not going to stop. This is the tip of the iceberg. We're going to be entrenched in this going forward. And if you are worried about doubts coming in to your faith, your testimony, the integrity of the church, and everything else, you're going to need President Oak's clear thinking on these things. You're going to be able to, as I say, parse things out. It's not a bumper sticker thing. You've got to know what's going on. Okay, furthermore, Paul Marrow says, likewise, this now familiar play is supposed to protect the LDS church, right? The pathway we're going down, and its adherents from threats to religious freedom. The play continues to be delusionary folly. This is his reaction, his approach to this. While the Respect for Marriage Act assures the imposition of same-sex marriage across the nation, it also creates a false flag in the name of religious freedom. What he means by false flag here is that his belief, and this is, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I'm pretty sure as I infer this, and I've talked to others around him, around Paul Marrow, that the false flag is that there is a problem with religious freedom. That's a threat. That's what he means by a false flag, right? That we're creating this idea that there's this imminent threat to religious freedom and same-sex marriage within our temples and our doctrine. He's saying that's not true. He says, yes, LDS church worship services such as temple marriages are protected, but worship services were never under attack. That false flag was spun up out of thin air. So his point is, we're building up the religious, the LGBTQ rights for same-sex marriage and supporting that, while at the same time building up something that's not necessary. That's his point, right? That there is no imminent threat on this. Now, that's one approach to this. Now, obviously, President Oaks doesn't believe that. He believes that there is a threat, or at least perceives that there is going to be a threat soon. So those are the two ways to think about this. Now, lastly, I want to go to his last paragraph here. He says, everything the LDS church has touched politically in this culture war is a tangled mess and has resulted in exactly the opposite of the desired outcome. Right? So his point here is that it is a losing cause for the church to be. It's not just a matter of whether or not they're supporting same-sex marriage or not supporting it. The issue for him is, why are we supporting it one way or the other? Why are we involved in the culture war? Right? And I would maybe add a little bit to this and say that it's a matter of why aren't we just preaching the gospel and inviting others to come to the gospel instead of going out and trying to politicize things and organize ourselves out in the culture to help meet the objectives of the church? Is that the right thing to do? And I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the tact that should always be taken on that. I try to bring in scriptural references to this. Like, you can go back and look at Isaiah. You can look at Jeremiah and Lehi in the time of Jeremiah. You can look at Abinadi and King Noah, right? You've got church versus state in many cases there, although those are all theocracies. And it's like, is it right to get involved at all in the culture war? Or is it simply a distraction? Or should we be out politicizing things and organizing to try and change the world? Or should we be simply preaching the gospel and inviting those who choose to come to Zion? Right? Those are points that should be thought about here. Another thing to think about here is he's pretty much right there as far as the outcomes whenever we've gotten involved with the culture war. Now, maybe members might do that more. I don't know. But should the church be involved with it? It's never really that I can think of. Maybe you could put in your comments there somewhere where that has been different. But so he goes on. Time and again, it has tried to serve the Lord without offending the devil. This is a comment originally made by Marion G. Romney. It was made into a talk by President Faust. I will say, I believe, this is my perception on this. I think that this is happening several times as far as messaging goes. It seems to me like as a church, and this is not just the leadership or anything else, but it seems to me that as we have grown and become more mainstreamed in the U.S., that there is this excitement about being accepted and about being a part of the larger community, whether it's the Christian community or overall part of the American fabric. And our focus seems to be, maybe you've perceived this, more along the lines of we want to please everybody instead of I'm going to stand firmly on these principles, which will create conflict because the world is moving in a different direction. But I will stand firmly on my principles and invite others to come to these principles. That's more along the lines of the way we used to talk. That's changed quite a bit in the last couple decades, quite a bit. And by the way, you see the exact same thing at BYU. The exact same thing that you see at BYU. And that's why BYU is so important to me, because it's not just the issue of the students and these college kids and their testimonies by being affected there, but it's a vanguard to the church. And you can see the effect it has on silencing people to stand on their principles, to preach the doctrine of Christ, to immerse the secular information and bathe that secular information in the gospel principles and the plan of salvation and the restored gospel. It's becoming tougher and tougher to do because of the environment, because of the culture. He finishes off by saying, please, for the sake of us faithful adherents, get out of politics, especially the modern American culture war. Preach sound doctrine such as found in the family, a proclamation of the world, and let us true believers in both faith and citizenship govern ourselves. Okay, so it's a very interesting take. I think I don't know if I agree 100% with it, but I agree with a lot of it. Now, I want to go into the Lee versus Romney element of this dispute over the two sides of supporting the bill and not supporting the bill. Obviously, Senator Lee does not support the bill. He wants an amendment put in there to make a change that will actually give what he believes is the proper support for religious freedom. And on the other side of that is Senator Romney, who does support the bill as is and wants it to move forward as is. There is a podcast that was put out by Ted Cruz, a very conservative senator. So you need to take that as it is and consider the source on this. Obviously, he's somewhat biased, but he brings up some interesting elements here of this that directly involve the church. I want to bring up a few of these points.
Well, let me tell you, this bill does considerable harm because you know what this fight really is about? It is about the Biden administration being able to persecute people of faith.
This is interesting.
Being able to persecute churches, K through 12 schools, universities, and charities, any religious organization that believes marriage is the union of one man and one woman.
Okay, so just first of all, his point is that the religious freedom, this Respect for Marriage Act does the exact opposite of what, say, a Senator Romney would say about this, right? That and in fact against what the church says about this, that it is protecting more religious freedom. Ted Cruz here is saying no. This does the opposite. It emboldens and weaponizes the issue of same-sex marriage with the institutions of the United States. It puts them in a much more vulnerable position. There's a little bit more on that.
And let me point out, this is not a hypothetical threat. I want to read to you from the transcript at the Obergefell oral argument, which was the gay marriage oral argument, where the Solicitor General, Don Verrilli, he was in the Obama Justice Department, and Justice Alito asked whether the next step would be for universities opposed to same-sex marriage to lose their tax-exempt status. So this is in the oral argument. And here's what General Verrilli replies, quote, "It's certainly going to be an issue. I don't deny that. I don't deny that. Justice Alito, it's going to be an issue."
Okay. So that's one of the major issues here that we're talking about. It's not the only issue, but on the ability to attack these institutions, one way that he's saying that government will be able to do this and have a better legal standing to do this is from the Respect for Marriage Act. And in fact, the amendment from Senator Lee forbids the government from being able to go after institutions that do not support same-sex marriage, religious institutions and others. And if they've got a tax, the churches are a 501c3, they're able to not have to pay taxes on the donations and everything else that they receive. Not everything else, but they have a protected tax status. And so the amendment from Senator Lee says you cannot come after these organizations and their tax status, their protected tax status with this bill, period. Or if they don't agree with same-sex marriage. Well, of course, that's being pushed off. As far as we know, that has not been brought up. Now, there's still a chance that could be inserted. We'll see if it does after Thanksgiving here. But so far, that has not been brought up to a vote for the amendment. And Senator Lee says, actually, I would vote for the bill if this amendment was included.
Senator Mike Lee is among those who say they are sort of toothless protections in there for religious minorities, and not minorities, but people who hold of whatever faith they are, this conviction about traditional marriage is his wording. He's offered this amendment. I've got it here in my hand. He says it's done in good faith. It will offer further protection to people in religious organizations. Why not allow a vote on the amendment? If that is truly an issue and it may get you more votes, but more protections for those who have religious freedom.
I would first of all point out the fact, I believe Mike Lee is a member of the Mormon Church. Mm-hmm. His organization, his church,
but he's still got concerns.
His church endorsed the legislation.
Okay, now Senator Cruz is going to go over this a little bit more, and notice what he talks about when he says the Mormon Church.
But that nasty little jab that, well, Mike Lee's a member of the Mormon Church supports it. I'm sorry, what an ass. I mean, going after Mike on his faith, that's disgusting.
Yeah, it's an attack on his faith.
Mark Warner ought to be embarrassed and ashamed. Now, what happened here with the Mormon Church, because actually he goes on to repeat Mormon Church like 19 times.
Okay, the point of that clip is understand that the statement by the church is not small, right? It's not that it's inconsequential. It is a talking point for both sides. You have the Democrats that are saying, "Hey, the church supports it," and then you have Ted Cruz here talking about it. And as he says in this Fox News interview, it's brought up he says 19 times. I don't know if he actually knows how many times it was brought up, but the point is that this statement, along with the position of Senator Lee and the opposing position of Senator Romney, are meaningful parts of what's going on here with this act. Now he's going to talk about Senator Romney a little bit.
Well, unfortunately, there is a senator who supports this bill from the state of Utah, who's named Mitt Romney, who happens to have some real juice within the Mormon church. He's kind of a big deal in Utah. And Mitt Romney has pulled out all the stops lobbying his church, and he convinced one senior figure in the church to put out a statement in favor of this bill. That senior figure, I'm sorry to say, got terrible legal advice. And if Mitt Romney weren't lobbying the heck out of it, I assume they wouldn't have done the statement, but Mitt was able to get it done now.
All right, now, so that's, by the way, I would say that knowing, regardless of which side you're on this, so you might be on a Romney side, you might be on the Lee side on this thing. It was, when I saw the statement, one of my first thoughts was, I wonder if Senator Romney was involved with this. Now, Ted Cruz seems to think he was. I think you can follow that line there that he speaks of pretty easily also. You can see what the battle is here. The battle here in many ways is focused on Lee and Romney. And it's not really much of a battle, really. I mean, this thing's going to pass. It is going to pass. The battle is whether or not this amendment gets put in there. One more point here on the IRS tax protected status of these institutions that do not agree with same-sex marriage.
The provisions in the bill are toothless, and they are. So what the bill is, the Democrats put into the bill language that says nothing in this bill shall be construed to deny tax exempt status to anybody. Now, I'm going to explain something to you, and this is why people hate lawyers.
This is interesting.
Nobody's suggesting the bill is going to deny tax exempt status. What's going to happen is after the bill passes, the Biden IRS is going to deny tax exempt status. And they're going to say, you know what? It's not the bill doing it. It's us.
Okay.
We are doing it. And so Mike Lee has drafted an amendment. It's a strong amendment that prohibits the Biden IRS from stripping tax exempt status for any institution based on their views on marriage.
Okay, so he's obviously being political, calling it the Biden IRS. It doesn't matter whether it's Biden's IRS. It could be the next president's or the president after that, right? But the point here is that it's interesting because you'll have a lot of members of the church and especially critics of the church really focused in on this issue of the tax exempt status of the church, and that their primary goal, and I'm not saying it's not part of their goal, it is. But their primary goal on any issue is to protect their tax-exempt status, and not doctrine, not the practice, not the members of the church, which is ridiculous to me, right? I'm not saying it's not important to them. It is important to them, and it is a driving force for them, and it should be, because you're talking about the strength, the economic strength of the church. But if it was so important to the church that they have the tax exempt status, wouldn't they not support the bill until the Lee amendment was in there? Right? That makes zero sense whatsoever. So the reason they're supporting the bill without the Lee amendment in there, which is just odd to me, but the reason they're doing it is because of the path that they are trying to go down. Whatever you think of that path, legally, culturally, that's their focus. Raise up the rights of the LGBTQ community and enforce the rights against the LGBTQ doctrine, so to speak, that would protect the church and other institutions that do not believe in the efficacy of a same-sex marriage. Now, lastly, I want to go over the family proclamation. This is another point of, what do we call it? It's a point of collision again here, because there are some things that are very concerning to me about this support for this bill from the church, and this is one of them. you and I know that as much as possible, those who want to fight for the strength and uniqueness of a traditional family use the family proclamation not as a club, as many people say, and if you do, that's certainly wrong, but as an anchor point of doctrine. And that has been reinforced, by the way, by President Oaks, who is the one forging this path, hacking his way through the jungle on this. But he's probably the one that has mentioned this more than anybody else, right? In referencing the family proclamation and the doctrine of the family. We've heard this from Elder Holland. We've heard this from many other church leaders, even in the past couple of years. Not as much as we used to, but we still hear that. But here's the issue with the family proclamation. Let's go to the last paragraph of the family proclamation here. And look at what it says. We call upon responsible citizens and officers of government everywhere to promote those measures designed to maintain and strengthen the family as the fundamental unit of society. So now that does not include the church there. It says responsible citizens and officers of government. But the church just went against that paragraph. Right? They just went, they supported a bill that is not maintaining the strength of the family, in my view. Right? In other words, in the past, they have always tied something like this last paragraph here of the family proclamation, to the culture war that they've fought with Prop 8 and everything else in other countries, in fact, where they've gotten involved politically, and states, to fight against same-sex marriage. Well, now they're doing the exact opposite. So what are responsible citizens and officers of government everywhere supposed to do now? If the church supports same-sex marriage in the United States, does it support same-sex marriage as a legal and cultural right, as it says LGBTQ rights in their statement, in other countries as well? What about more conservative countries where the church is growing rapidly, in the Philippines and in Africa? Do they support the rights of, does the church support the LGBTQ rights of same-sex marriage in those countries? What do citizens of the United States do, members of the church and other citizens of the United States and officers of the government? Do they still fight against these types of things? Do they vote against these types of things? It says to promote those measures designed to maintain and strengthen the family as the fundamental unit of society. Here's my concern, is if that looks like it's a hypocritical statement, or if the church isn't, because of this statement that was put out by the church, it seems to undermine the church. Are they going to reference it as much? Does it hold the same strength that it did previously? And if they reference it less and less because of the conflict of that paragraph, does it have the same efficacy? Is it as strong as it should be? And for those that want to hold up the family proclamation and see it as a hill that they do want to die on, and whether culturally or doctrinally, or teaching within the church and supporting and the support of their own families, does this weaken that document? I think that's a legitimate question with this. We need to be educated and aware of these things and what is happening here. I know that most of the church doesn't even know about the statement that the church made or about the Respect for Marriage Act, even within the United States. I want to go here, and I've talked about this previously, but please look at this. D&C 58, starting in verse 26. For behold, it is not meet that I should command in all things, I get so many people saying the prophet didn't talk about this or the prophet didn't do this. I will make the argument that the prophet is trying to make you decide for yourself and to govern yourself, because we've been too coddled in the church and created a culture where we simply wait and listen instead of acting. And you can look at the Strength of Youth pamphlet as an example, pulling back on the very specifics of that and saying, here are some generalities and you need to govern yourself and your own children. You need to take on personal responsibility. I get so many responses that are like this. Why are you even talking about this, Greg? What's the point of talking about this? Again, 26, for behold, it is not meet that I should command in all things. For he that is compelled in all things, the same is a slothful and not a wise servant. Wherefore he receiveth no reward. And keep going here. Verily, verily, I say, men should be anxiously engaged in a good cause, and do many things of their own free will, and bring to pass much righteousness. For the power is in them, wherein they are agents unto themselves. And inasmuch as men do good, they shall in no wise lose their reward. I hope that we can do that we're not waiting on everything from a church authority to talk to us. Of course, we sustain those church authorities. Of course, we stay within those parameters of doctrine within the church and even policy in the church. And we support and sustain. That's crucial. And I don't know of any, what do I call this podcast? Any public statements that are made that are going to be more sustaining of the church and the brethren than I am. But that doesn't mean that we continue in a culture of simply waiting and waiting and waiting. That's not right. That's not what Joseph Smith taught. That just isn't right. And the prophets have never taught that. Ever. This is what we need to look at, is that section 58. Now, the freest nation in the world, the United States, it is absorbing these new ideologies, this identitarianism that has worked like a virus. It comes in, it tries itself out for a little while, it loses, it leaves, and then mutates, and then comes back again. And then it shakes things up a little bit, makes things sick a little bit, and then get the immune system of the fabric of the United States and the Constitution and the culture fight it off, and it leaves. And then it mutates, and then it comes back. Well, this iteration of this virus, this mutation of this virus this time around, this critical social justice and this identitarianism, has mutated to the point where it is affecting us in every possible way, including for many feeling an earthquake that is happening with them, with the church. We need to be aware of what is happening. I hope we can continue to educate ourselves, to learn what is going on, understand these philosophies, understand these political and cultural currents that we are living through, because we need to have a very buoyant ark. We need a buoyant ark, because otherwise we will simply drown in the waters without that. Thanks for listening.